What words come to mind when you hear dispute management? Procedure, resolution process, tribunal, economic development. And what are some of the underlying industries that use dispute management? Construction, for instance, insurance, maritime, trade, investment, sport, and intellectual property are just a few. Disputes, otherwise called conflicts or disagreements, often stem from a misunderstanding or single or multiple communication breakdown. Welcome to the Dispute Management in a New World podcast, a bi-weekly conversation series with Dr. Christopher Malcolm, Secretary General of the Jamaica International Arbitration Center, JAIAC. The series is brought to you in association with the JDIC. My name is Anika Nelson.
And I'm Roxy Nickel. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Christopher Malcolm has over 20 years' experience as a dispute management practitioner. He's an academician, international legal consultant, innovator, institution builder, and social entrepreneur. The pursuit of peace, security, and economic well-being are his guiding philosophies. But there's so much more to the JAIAC's Secretary General. So, without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Malcolm. Hello, Dr. Malcolm.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you for being here. So let's get right into it. Tell us a little of who is Dr. Christopher Malcolm.
You've said a mouthful of who I am, but beyond that, I have been a lawyer, qualified as one at any rate. One of the reluctant ones. Never ever wanted to be a lawyer, and I like to tell people the interesting story about it. I was a good Sunday school attendee, and in Sunday school I learned something that said that there was a war to lawyers and doctors. And in that process, I determined at a very early age that since I wanted to go to heaven, I could not become a lawyer or a doctor. And it is interesting because that germ that started then has impacted my life throughout. And even now that I have qualified as a lawyer and have been practicing as one, I still do not see myself as a lawyer. But notwithstanding, I would, if I were to relive my life, still get into the discipline of law because I think it's the best profession I could acquire in support of my more interested field, which is involvement in the area of economic development, sustainable economic development. And I think law is perhaps the best discipline that could get me in that area where my passion really lies.
And you've been in this legal profession for about 20 years or so, or more.
Yeah, just about 25.
Take us a little through a little of the journey that you've had in this legal profession.
Well, the journey having qualified as a lawyer, I practiced for a bit and then went off to do postgraduate work in the area at that time, focusing on legal aspects of banking and finance. And as part of that postgraduate journey, I then got involved in the area of dispute management through arbitration, commercial arbitration. I went to Queen Mary University, London, where I did an LLM and subsequently a PhD. And it was that process, I think, that pulled me into an area where I felt I had some real interest. And it's instructive that when I went off to do postgraduate studies, so disinterested I think I was in continuing as a lawyer that I did not even do what lawyers tend to do, which is to save precedents and do all these sorts of things. I had no real interest in becoming caught up again in the practice of law as we traditionally learned it. However, having gone off and done this further level of qualification and then finding my footing in an area that I felt was more in concert with who I am, I have learned to re-appreciate the value of law. And it is instructive. I started out by saying earlier that I did not want to be a lawyer or a doctor. But it's instructive that I actually ended up having a terminal degree in law, which means that I can call myself doctor. And I also teach people to become lawyers. So I have become, in and out of quotes, a lawyer who's a doctor. so that, I think, is the irony of ironies. that you sometimes find that you're pulled into areas that you have no great interest in.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also true that as a teacher, I will tell anybody to do law if you don't have an idea of what you want to become. Law is probably one of the best fields you could think of because it has so much implication. There's so many areas that we could think of. And there's so many persons I know who are qualified lawyers who have never really practiced a day in law.
That is true.
They use the learning in other areas, in business, in banking, in insurance, in all sorts of areas. And the reason you're able to do it is because the learning of law enables you to take an analytic approach to matter that is transferable and easily transferable across a wide range of areas.
You were also involved in some amount of practice as the Attorney General in the British Virgin Islands. Tell us a little bit about that experience. What was it like?
Well, I was involved in some amount of practice before becoming the Attorney General in the British Virgin Islands, but that was part of my journey as well.
Yes.
Because what happened is that while I was teaching, I went on a period of leave for 3 years from Mona to become the Attorney General of the British Virgin Islands for the period January 2012 to December 2014, a full three calendar years. And that process was again instructive because that was the first time in my life that I was working in the public sector. Before that, all the work that I had done was in the private sector. So I went off and accepted a job in the public sector, and that gave me a whole new exposure as well to the area of policy design and development, and in fact, working in the heart of government and understanding how governments function, how policies developed and supported by lawyers. And it, of course, gave me a level of exposure in a number of areas that I'm eternally grateful for. And that too has supported my greater interest, as I call it, in the area of sustainable economic development. So I've had a rounded area of development. I've been a legal practitioner. I've been an academic in law. I have been as an Attorney General. And I also, for a short while, served as head of the legal unit of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. I've also been involved in that area of regional development, which again falls back into what I did when I did my postgraduate studies, certainly at the PhD level. I was examining the area of sustainable development in the context of regional integration. And that is a part of why, in a very real way, I can say without any hesitation that I'm as Caribbean as they get, because I understand the region. I've had quite a bit of a footprint across the region, really, and I'm genuinely interested in seeing us advance together as a region and being able to work beyond the region, of course, outwards to the rest of the globe, but understand that we're unique. We have our own differences, but we also have a lot that bind us together. And through this process of learning and understanding each other, we have been able to develop quite a bit, actually. We have been unique. People, for example, have not stood back enough to understand just how important the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States has been in the development of the globe. They have developed a unified currency that has been working and working well for a number of years. They have a unit there that has simply been amazing in terms of what it has done. And I think very often as we think about our regional development, we very often need to look sub-regionally to what the OECS has done through their central bank, which is its own standard, has been functioning very well for a very long time. As I said, their currency earlier, their approach to joint, getting medicines across the region together. There's so many things that they do well. And I think we have lessons within the region that we must learn, and we must value ourselves in terms of what we can do. Recognizing always, of course, that we're not an island entirely to ourselves. We're part of a globe. But as we go to the globe, we also must understand who we are and what we're able to take to it with us.
The words dispute management, what comes to mind? 3 words immediately.
Collaboration comes to mind, and I'll explain why in a minute. Getting to a result that satisfies as many as is possible comes to mind. And avoidance of adversarial proceedings also comes to mind.
Let us assume that there's somebody out there who doesn't know what that is. Can you explain exactly what it is?
Well, dispute management is really a process. It's not an end in and of itself. So what we have here, if you think about any arrangement that you could enter into, whether it is a personal relationship, whether it is a professional one, whether it is states as between themselves in a community of states, Jamaica and Barbados, Jamaica, Bahamas, whatever it is. What happens in that context is that you're always having conflicting thoughts.
Right.
There are no two persons that you will get in a room who think exactly the same way. And the moment you have contending views, you have the possibility for a dispute arising. So what you then have to think of, if you're thinking of harmony, peace, security, and all the other things that matter to us, you have to find a way of being able to pull people together where they're able to manage those contending views to a point where they're able to coexist and to get to the end result, which we all would like to have.
Yes.
So management, then, if you think about it, in the context of disputes, is a process where you initially set out to try to identify the inherent or other risks that could arise by way of contending views or through the contending views that will prevent harmonized solutions from arising or for end results that people want from manifesting. So that is part of that process. Then having identified them, you want to now start thinking of how it is that you may be able to implement systems or mechanisms that can better manage how those relationships emerge and what you do in them so as to prevent conflicts from manifesting, or if they do manifest, so as to dampen the effects that they could have, the maleffects, that is. And then having got to that point, there's then a recognition that as part of a management process, you understand that even with those things having happened, meaning you identify inherent risks or risks that could arise, you put systems in place as to how you could better manage those risks. You get to a point where invariably there is going to be a point at which, with the best of intentions, disputes do arise. So the question is, how do you then manage them? So if we're to think of dispute management in that holistic vein, it is a question of trying to understand that we live in an environment, we function in circumstances where disputes are as a matter of course. They are as a matter of everyday living.
True.
So you then understand and recognize that. So you then have to put systems in place when you're starting a dialogue, a conversation, to ensure that let us try to understand if we're trying to do a business together. Let's say we're in the business of trying to sell microphones. And we're going to see, I produce them, you sell them. You start thinking, well, what if I do not produce the microphones to the quality you desire? What if I produce the microphones and you do not have money to pay me? And those are questions that you have to ask yourself if you're trying to put a business model together. And there's several others. I'm simplifying it, of course. You then have to start thinking, okay, fine, now that we've identified those as inherent or possible risks, what can we do to ensure that you put those protections in place that I can produce the microphones consistently and to the quality? So quality control issues come in, right? And then having dealt with that, the question is, but notwithstanding all those quality control measures, what if this happens that they're still not produced on time, or you're not able to pay me as I produce them? What do we then do? And you now want to understand, okay, fine, if we're in a relationship together, notwithstanding that a dispute has manifested, we may still want to maintain our good relations, so we may want to be able to talk it over. We may want to put systems in place where we can, in a very amicable way, deal with our disputes without it getting out to all and sundry. In a real sense, we find ways where we can try to get to the point where we are able to avoid airing our dirty laundry in public. So that's a critical element of that management process, because it's us, it's a relationship, and you want to keep the relationship together. You don't want to get it too far apart. But then beyond that, if I were to just complete that statement, you get to the point where you ultimately have to get to that airing in public, in any event. How do you then do it in such a manner that you get to the quickest result possible, in the most cost-effective and efficient manner possible, where you, even if you have to part ways, you do so without burning down all the bridges? And that is what Management 101 is about. It's about getting to a solution where there are effective processes for communication and people understand the end result, and they try to find an effective way to work towards that without having to create unnecessary chaos.
Right, definitely.
Of course, reminding you that you are listening or joining us for the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series. It's brought to you in association with the JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me. Dr. Malcolm, in continuing, your guiding philosophy is peace, security, and economic well-being. How do you translate that into your work as a dispute management practitioner?
But it's funny, there was a retired Chief Justice of a country I shall not name at the moment, who said to me that the majority of disputes, including murders and a number of other things that come before her, come on the basis of people simply not being able to communicate effectively with each other. So at the core of trying to resolve disputes is ensuring that you have effective systems for communication. Now, at the core of trying to deal with peace, it is again about ensuring that people are communicating. And remember the lesson of communication, which you media practitioners will tell me. It's not just about sending a message. It's about ensuring that the message is delivered as sent and understood. So if it is that you're talking about peace and you understand that at the heart of war and at the heart of people not getting along very often, it's not a lack of wanting common objectives, you know. It's not a lack of wanting to have a common goals achieved.
Right.
It's a situation where people have not communicated well enough how it is that you're going to get there. And at the heart of that, if you don't get that done properly, instead of working collaboratively to an end, you are bickering your way to problems and wars and people chopping up each other. We have heard stories in different places of people, brothers and sisters, killing each other over a simple dumpling, as we would say in Jamaica, something to eat. In a family, and the question is, how could we have avoided that? How could we have ensured that people found an easier way of talking it over rather than resorting to violence, rather than resorting to cussing each other, rather than resorting to walking on different sides of the road? Not because they do not want a common end, but because they do not understand how to get there. So what dispute management does, if we go back to where I started, is you try to, in any situation, try to understand what the likely risks for dispute would be. Try to understand as well how it is that you can manage that better to a common end. And if you do that well enough, you will get people talking to each other rather than fighting with each other. And when we say fight, it is not necessarily the literal fight. It could be figurative. It could be fight in a court of law. It could be fight in all sorts of contexts. And those things are critical because they are at the core of what war as distinct from peace becomes. And when we think of war and peace, we should not always think of it in terms of heavy artillery and so on. Peace is much more critical than that, in my view. Peace starts at the community level. Peace starts within families. And if you get individuals and families and communities and so on working together, and then having that peace translated beyond, then you get to a point where people are able to live peaceably. You then have greater security, because if I am concerned about your well-being and about peace between us, it is not in my interest to see you suffer.
True.
It is not in my interest to see your downfall. And that will then translate where peace among individuals become peace within the community, peace among countries, and so on and so forth. And people may say it's utopian, you know. But the truth is that many thoughts must begin in utopia. And if we don't have utopian vision, it is unlikely that we're going to get to what we practically can achieve in a good way anyway. So I don't have a difficulty being labeled utopian. And I don't have a difficulty with people saying, but those ideas are not achievable, because the truth is, it is very often the unachievable that we must strive for in order to get what we can realistically achieve to a common end that makes good sense.
Awesome, awesome. So let's move a little into your area of research, because I realize in 2019, you received the UE Mona Principles Award for Research. Tell us about that and some of the other recognitions that you've had.
Well, my research there, or the work for which I was awarded, was research having to do with ADR in the context of the Caribbean, and also more particularly in the context of Jamaica. But I have been for quite a while focused on doing work in that area of dispute settlement, including at some point ago, in fact, only earlier, I was pulling up a publication I had done from as far back as 2004, where I was exploring the concept of dispute settlement vulnerability, and had as early as about 2003 thereabouts started developing what I consider to be a dispute settlement vulnerability index to try to identify some of those factors that make some countries less capable than others for resolving their disputes. And I would also go so far as to say, if we were to do a mapping of the globe, we will find that those societies which do well at resolving disputes tend also to be the same ones who do better in their economies. So there is some level of translation. And I think it is important that as we consider economics, we also should be considering the value of dispute settlement in that. And I tell persons all the time, and the economists and bankers may not agree with me, but I tell persons that at the core of the societies that we now have and the developments that we have achieved, it's not banking, it's not finance, it is law. Why? Because prior to that common law case that we know about in our common law context of Solomon and Solomon, which said that the company was separate from its shareholder individuals, separate legal personality, you never could have had a multilateral the way we have them now. Why? Because there's no individual who could take the risk of any of the big companies you could think of. So what happened is that by that legal process of defining separate legal personality, you then created the basis for an economic development initiative, or initiative surrounding it, that have allowed us to build out big companies and so on and so forth. The other side to it as well, as we're thinking about that, is that without the legal process, which gives us certainty, and which enables us to have the rule of law, which deals with questions of justice and so on and so forth, without those systems that you can resort to, you would have constant bickering. And in the presence of constant bickering, there is the inability to grow and develop. So the legal process is that which is at the core of that. And it is anything you can think of. Money. What is money? Money is legal fiction. Money is money because the law says it is money. And you could think of anything that you could multiply beyond that. If you think of the medical profession, you think of the banking and finance, any of the regulations and so on surrounding how they function are as a matter of legal processes that have been developed. So the law then is that glue which properly developed and properly considered enables you to put in place systems that allow for economic expansion. And it is part of what I'm interested in, how it is that we can come to that clear recognition and have it spread more widely. And having come to that recognition then, how it is that we can develop processes that are more enabling rather than disabling of sustainable economic development. And that is where my interest is, and that is where my research interest lies.
I understand where you do the research, but do you do it from a broader level or from a community level to get others into the mindset of dispute management, that it is something that is that kind of resolution is the preferred way before we air our laundry?
You do things at both the micro and the macro level. So I have, for example, been involved at the micro level in terms of dealing with individuals and communities. I have, if you want to consider it that way. But I've also been involved at the policy and more macro level. I did say earlier, you mentioned earlier that I was an attorney general. In that role, for example, I was doing work at a greater policy and more of a macro level. In the context of other jurisdictions in the region, including Jamaica, I have also been involved in the development of initiatives that are law-based, which is again at a more macro level. So it really is a combination. I don't think it is in the context of law and dispute management, it's not advisable, I would say, to try to make this great separation, because we understand that there's such a connection between the two. And if you don't get it working right at any of the levels, you could have a breakdown at one level, having all sorts of disabling effects for other levels. So it is important to try to achieve harmony, not just within particular arenas, but by reference to other arenas as well. So you're looking for holistic development and holistic approaches to dispute management with an understanding, of course, that it is central to whatever we're doing if we want to do it well.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the institutions, particularly the JAIAC and the Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution. Those are institutions that you have been directly involved with the establishment for. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I have, for a very long time, felt it was appropriate for us to find ways in our own contexts, not to be insular, because I'm completely against anything that is insularity laced. I just am not for that at all. But I always thought that it was important to understand that we need to find things that enable us to express ourselves and to do the things that we need to do. And, you know, as I say that, I'm always reminded, of course, that while you do not have to be a chef to criticize the cooking, until you walk a mile or even less in a man's shoe, you have no idea what his life is. And it is not, you're not in any real position, I think, to speak effectively for him or for her, all right? So it's important that we get to that point. And I thought that in the context of our region, there were things which were unique to us and which we needed to have our own expression in. And it is not to say we're not constantly relying and being replenished by others. But I think we also needed to understand that we have unique circumstances and we should develop things. So the JAIAC was developed as an initiative to enable us to find effective ways to administer disputes relating to us, while at the same time building capacity. And at the same time as well, ensuring that we had outward linkages that would enable us to support others where we're able to and be supported by others. And that is part of what has driven us. We haven't got to exactly where we want to get yet, but we've started on a path. We have had some significant achievements, and we will continue to have those. Now, the CIADR, the Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution, is another which was developed primarily with education, capacity building, training, and so on in mind, and to create a network, again, with outward vista, that will allow us to develop things which are unique to us, but at the same time relying on best practice. And best practice is quite global. That will enable us to ensure that we are able to do that. And you know what is instructive, again, as I mentioned that? I, again, was looking, as I said, at a publication earlier that I'd done 20 or so years ago. And one of the things I looked at then and I thought, boy, you were really thinking ahead. Really, I did. Because I was looking at capacity building, for example. And I was there contemplating and writing that it really is not an end, it's a process. And it's a process of ensuring that you have thought propagation of thought, that you had a situation where you had onboarding of ideas from wherever you find them, and you had a situation where you were sufficiently nuanced to recognize the needs of the communities that you serve. So the CIADR was set up again with my core being dispute management, to see how it is that we could recognize things which are truly global, things which are unique to us, and to develop training and other programs that were able to serve our needs while not being so insular as to forget that we're part of a global community. So those two initiatives we've worked with, and in all of those initiatives, we have consistently worked with and been supported by persons from across the globe, from Asia, from Africa, from wherever. We have always maintained relationships that are far and wide. And in those contexts, we always try to ensure that we don't just hear what others have to say, but we also have our input and enable others to critique us, as we're able to critique others. Because we do not simply go to the table thinking that we know nothing, but we also do not go to the table thinking that we know everything. But we do believe there are contributions we can make, and we also believe there are contributions others are making from which we should learn.
You want to tell us a little bit about just some of the areas that those institutions provide training in, or?
Well, training there is really, we look at things, again, related to dispute management. We've looked at things in mediation, arbitration, adjudication.
Excellent.
Conflicts management at one level or another. And we've done them for individuals, institutions, public and private sector. That's what we've done. And we've worked, as I said, with collaborating partners from far and wide. And in the context, you may mention at some point, well, one of the things we've done, for example, through the JAIAC, is that we have developed a webinar series called Coffee Time at JAIAC, where we have, again, thought to ensure that we have access to and we rely upon thought leaders, international thought leaders, who are able to assist us as we develop our thinking and as we get to a point where we're better able to assist and support the initiative, the underlying initiatives, which really focus on how can we build better to be able to support ourselves and to be able to do better when we get to stages where we have to manifest whatever it is that we do.
What would you consider would be the best piece of dispute management advice you've ever received?
You should listen, not be arrogant about what it is that you're doing, and never take the position that you're preaching to anybody. And those are important. But insofar as dispute management is concerned, one of the things we need to learn, always, I think, and it is something that I work on every day, is how you can understand that the people that you're talking to, the ones with problems that are coming to you, are persons who are much more acutely aware of what their situation is than you would ever be. And until you get to an understanding of how it is to walk in their shoes, you will never be able to get to that point of giving them the sort of advice and support that will allow them to achieve what they're hoping for. Because everybody is unique, and we all have unique problems, and it is unique solutions, albeit with general foundations in place, that will allow persons to get to where they want and to get to an understanding of what brought them there in the first place, what they can do to cauterize the problem that has arisen, and what they can also do to ensure that they minimize the possibility of going forward with those sorts of problems. And it doesn't matter whether it is in a personal relationship, a commercial relationship, whatever it is. The basic position is trying to get to an understanding of what is it that I am facing? How is it that this dispute manifested in the first place? What can be done about it now to cauterize the problem? But more importantly, I think, what can I do to ensure that going forward, this is put behind me and I do not have to deal with something like it again?
Final question, Doc. Dispute management in a new world. That's the name of the podcast series. How did we get to this concept of the podcast series?
It came about at the time that the implications of COVID had started. And at that stage, it hit me that we were, in fact, entering into a new world where we were dealing with circumstances we have never dealt with prior. So that was new. But being in the Caribbean myself and being somebody who has always enjoyed history, and I still do, I remember that when we were discovered, we were considered to have been the new world. So for me, the question was, how do we, in the context of what was considered to be the new world, in circumstances which are indicative of a new world, get around to recognizing the inherent difficulties in it, what some of those commonalities are, not just for us, but for persons elsewhere as well, and how we can work in it. And for me, the idea was, let us recognize that there's a new emergence. And let us recognize that some of the things that are gone are simply gone. Those things that are gone, and we're into a new dispensation, and those in the Bible can tell me what the exact Bible verse is. But we understood very clearly that it could never be same old, same old. And we understood clearly that we wanted as well that as we were developing something, that we wanted to make it clear that we were doing so from the context of what we knew. And what I know better than anything else is our region and what some of our difficulties are. And so I wanted to ensure that we centered it around who we are, while at the same time recognizing the global implications. And that is why, notwithstanding the centrality of who we are in it, we have always and still do understand that we are not entire to ourselves. We're not islands entire to ourselves. We're connected to the globe, and we ought to function in that way. So dispute management in a new world is recognizing dispute managements are inevitable. We are in the new world at two critical levels, as I've mentioned, and we need to do things with that in mind.
Doc, we're out of time for this episode of the podcast series, so we're going to have to invite you back to continue with part 2 and invite our listeners and viewers to join us as well for the continuation of the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series, Conversations with Dr. Christopher Malcolm. We wrap things up with a repeat of our quote, and it says, disputes, otherwise called conflicts or disagreements, often stem from a misunderstanding or single or multiple communication breakdown. You just heard part 1 of our 2-part conversations introducing Dr. Christopher Malcolm. Until then, I'm Anika.
And I'm Roxy Nickel. And on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us.
What words come to mind when you hear dispute management? Procedure, resolution process, tribunal, economic development. And what are some of the underlying industries that use dispute management? Construction, for instance, insurance, maritime, trade, investment, sports, and intellectual property are just a few. Disputes are unavoidable outcomes of trade, investment, and commercial as well as personal relationships, which need to be managed or resolved in a cost-effective and timely manner. Technology is being increasingly used to facilitate the resolution of disputes between parties around the globe. This program is produced with the kind sponsorship of the Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation, JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC deposit insurance scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
Special thanks to ADEB Consultants Limited, consulting engineers practicing for over 40 years. iNeutral, dispute resolution made easy. CP Malcolm, dispute management practitioner. Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution Limited, CIADR. Mona Law Faculty, the University of the West Indies, Mona. Impact Justice, improved access to justice in the Caribbean. Stay tuned to all our podcast episodes exploring the concept of dispute management, its appropriate use, options for stability in business relationships, and how it supports sustainable economic development. All our podcast episodes are distributed via these platforms: Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.